It's not very often when I get a chance to talk about my personal experience in sports journalism. And a lot of what the show is predicated on is my knowledge inside being a press person, being a member of the media, my years of being a live radio host, my years of being a sports writer, and, providing some of the insight that goes into the life of a journalist. And a lot of that, feeds a lot of my opinions on this show. It affects my process and how I look logically at certain topics or certain events. And there really hasn't been that much of a chance to talk about that before today. But Coach Krzyzewski, head basketball coach of Duke, had a little bit of I don't necessarily know how to phrase this, but him and he called out and kind of roasted a student reporter for a question. And he, it ended up getting some viral attention on social media. Coach K ended up calling the reporter and apologizing to him. And I just found this so interesting, and I kind of wanted to talk about what press conferences are like, especially for a student reporter, how they were beforehand and how they're different now, and kind of give a little insight onto what happened. Because every once in a while, a big coach or a big player, has a little bit of a temper tantrum when a reporter asks a question that they don't really like. And the response isn't always next question. Sometimes you get some responses. And I thought that Coach Krzyzewski's response in comparison to a lot of others, was very tame. A very, very tame response. I think, the response wasn't necessarily harsh. Was it a little unnecessary? Yes. But again, I've seen a lot of other players and a lot of other coaches say a lot worse to reporters, never mind students. And I actually had the benefit, believe it or not, of being able to be in a press conference with Coach Krzyzewski. It was the season in which Zion Williamson, what's his, Reddick? No, not Reddick. Reddish, Cam Reddish, and R.J. Barrett. Those three were at Duke, and I was at Florida State at the time, and I was able to cover that game, and Cam Reddish hit a buzzer-beater 3-point shot to win the game for Duke. And I was able to sit in and ask questions with Coach K in that press conference, and that experience in of itself was insanely cool. Like, I don't fanboy over many people, but to see Coach Krzyzewski sit there in the Donald L. Tucker Center, the media center, or the media conference room, and he had his hands folded like this, and all you could see were his rings. He looked like the Godfather. And that was actually the moment that I realized that I wanted to do sports media for a living, was that press conference. It was absolutely very cool. But I say that to say this, that the cadence that Krzyzewski had in that press conference was not any different from the cadence that Krzyzewski had in this press conference that went viral. And his response, although it was kind of deemed as a bit of a roast, as a bit of a comeback at the student reporter going after it, I think that's a little snowflakey. I didn't really see or hear anything that would suggest that, he was really trying to go after the student reporter. I think he was really just trying his best to equate the situation and try to, I don't know, necessarily set the tone for the press conference, because a lot of the relationship between reporters and the coach, there's a big feeling out process. Depending on what happened during the game, and I want to point this out, depending on what happened during the game definitely fuels the way that you phrase your questioning when you're in these press conferences. And especially over Zoom, it's a little bit more difficult to kind of get a general feel for how the coach or the player may be feeling during that specific point in time. The guy's question wasn't all that bad. I don't know if it was specifically the first question that was asked, because that might make a difference in of itself. If it was the first question asked in the entire press conference, I can guarantee you that is what prompted the response from Krzyzewski, was because it was the first question. It wasn't a bad question, but it was a question that probably would have been saved for later in the press conferences. if I were that reporter, or in my experience with working with other reporters, those type of questions typically get pushed back towards the end of the conference. Once the two parties have settled in, once the coaches have made an opening statement, once the coaches have addressed a couple of questions, you can get an idea about what the coach wants to talk about and what they don't want to talk about. And sometimes it's hard. Sometimes you have a really burning question that would be a good question that probably won't be best received by the coach or by the player, and you have to ask it anyway. It's all about finding the right opportunity to ask the question that will give you the best chance of getting a great response. If the coach just talked about how his team shot horrible from three-point range, maybe throw a more positive question at the coach next to kind of bounce between negative and positive to get a good balance. Because I can tell you one thing, people just don't want to be negative all the time. People want to take away the positives, especially with a team like Duke, in which they, I believe, are 5-5 on the season, and they have dropped out of the top 25 for the first time in whoever knows how long, and are in danger of missing the NCAA tournament for the first time in like 16 years. So with that all in context, I think that the reaction to what Coach Krzyzewski said to the reporter was very much so overblown. I have definitely heard press members ask worse questions at worse times to other players and coaches. And obviously, everybody handles everything differently. But I think that although Coach Krzyzewski's response probably could have been phrased a better way, he didn't necessarily have to go into the whole schooling analogy. He could have just answered it with, we're just moving forward. We're going to sit down and look at tape, yada, yada, yada. I think it was just an error by Krzyzewski, and every coach says something that they shouldn't at some point in time. But the reaction by everybody saying, oh, Coach K shouldn't have said that to a student reporter. I think everybody's being a little bit too sensitive about the topic, and I definitely think that the student reporter took this a little bit and ran with it. I've definitely gotten some coarse responses when I ask questions, and I know that others have as well. Especially if it's a new face in the press conference. By after a while, especially when you've been in an institution for so many years, coaches and players will start recognizing people in the press conference. And when a new face appears, I don't know how long this new student reporter has been covering Duke basketball, but if he's a newer face and the coach doesn't know him, he's more likely to get a not so good response, a response like the one that he got, as opposed to if a trusted media member asked Krzyzewski that question, he probably would have responded to it in a different way. Coaches can tell when you're green, and I think that probably was a lot of the process, was that Coach Krzyzewski recognized that this reporter was very green and he didn't see him very often, so maybe he was trying to appeal or not maybe not appeal, but he was trying to adjust his answer for the reporter. And he made some errors in judgment in how he presented that answer. So I think the response and the viral outrage, maybe outrage isn't even the right word either, but I think the response was a little bit overblown. Hopefully I've provided some insight into what those press conferences are like. It's very much so a feeling out process with the coaches and the media. Sometimes, you have a burning question that you're like, maybe I shouldn't ask this right away. Let's ask a more positive question and establish some good standing with the coach before coming in with a more negative question. Talk about, how this one player played and how pleased you were about this one player. And then you go say, well, all right, so what do you guys think about what do you think about the team moving forward? That's how I would have done it. There are certain ways to ask a question, and the timing to ask a question, and the more experience you have in press conferences, the more you'll begin to understand how to basically legitimately read the room. A lot of being a reporter is reading the room, understanding what questions to ask at what times, and understanding how to phrase that question so you don't get your butt burned by specific people. But yeah, I think a lot of this was overblown. I don't feel like an apology was necessarily warranted, but good on Krzyzewski for issuing an apology anyway. A lot of this was overblown, but hey, hopefully that gives you some insight as to what actually being in these press conferences is like, as opposed to just watching them, afterwards. Because what doesn't get translated over audio and visual is the feeling of the room, and bouncing off other reporters' questions and understanding what question to ask at the right time. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching this segment from the Hard Headed Sports Podcast. You've heard what I've had to say, now I'm interested to hear what you think as well. If you enjoyed this highlight from the show and want to watch more highlights from the show as they come out after the show's completion, you should definitely subscribe to the YouTube channel, and if you're interested in listening to the entire show in its full-length entirety, you should follow the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Anchor. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you all very soon.